All right, let me show you how this is done, Dante. Okay, ready? Here we go. This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Okay, all right, interesting. Shawn Merwin, what would you say to
What's
that?
happening? I don't like this.
I am an absolute sucker for a dead body with a journal.
Well, I want to know how many of those books James Hake wrote for.
Leave a YouTube comment. You can leave a YouTube comment.
Dale, I'm going to ask you a kind of snarky question.
We're just going to sit here in silence. That's the plan.
I mean, it doesn't have to be silence.
You know, Baldur's Gate is a computer game. D&D is a pen and paper role-playing game.
Force feed, here comes the airplane, here comes the law.
I'm afraid to answer differently than Dale, so what she said.
All that and more right now. Boom!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. That's right, this is #1. My name is Ben Byrne, and I am joined, as always, by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. And James, I have to ask, initiative order. What do you use for initiative?
Bog standard. I have heard many different types of initiatives suggested over the years, and the only one that's ever appealed to me other than make a list of everyone going in order, the same way 5th edition D&D does it, is the way that Lancer does it.
Okay.
Which is, first the players go, one, among yourselves pick who's going, then the GM chooses one enemy to go, then the players pick the next player to go, until all the players are done, then the rest of the enemies go. And then we start over from the beginning again. It works really well in that game because it permits combos between players, and I really like the teamwork that facilitates.
I, like James, try to use standard because there are alternatives that are suggested in many places, including in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that don't really work well. They sound good until you actually do them. The only alternative initiative in a D&D-like game that I have a hankering for is Rob Schwalb's Shadow of the Demon Lord, and now Shadow of the Weird Wizard, where they break it down into slow and fast, where if you are just doing one thing, you go on the fast turn, players first, then monsters. And if you're taking a slow turn, then the slow turn people go players first, then monsters. And I think that makes sense, and it is not so dramatically different from a typical initiative that it makes it too wonky to use.
That kind of reminds me, it sounds like a very simplified version of, I think, RuneScape, I think it is, which has like your initiative is based on if you're attacking with a dagger, you go 4 in the initiative order. Yeah. But if you're, casting a spell, it's like 12. And then if you're shooting a bow, I thought this was really interesting. It's like you're at initiative 2 to nock an arrow, and then it's like initiative 8 to actually fire the arrow. So you kind of go twice. That sounds like I found that really would do my head in as an archer, because I was just like, wait, I have to wait till when to be able to do this what felt like a very simple thing from D&D. Dael Kingsmill, what about yourself?
My favorite version of initiative is Popcorn Initiative, which is similar to what James was describing. It's, whoever goes first. I like it to be whoever says I'm attacking goes first, and then they choose who goes after them, and then that person chooses who goes after them. And no one can go twice until everyone else has had a turn, including the bad guys. And I find that there's kind of a natural narrative selection that comes about through that, because if the players just go, oh, well, we'll just all go, then they will learn very quickly that after they go, all the bad guys get to go, and then they also get to choose who goes at the start of the next round. So they will get a second set of turns, right? Because whoever goes last gets to choose who goes next. So I find there's kind of a natural ebb and flow that develops after a little while of that. But it does not work for D&D. So when it comes to D&D, I use standard initiative. My one tweak is that when people are rolling initiative, I let them roll with either wisdom or dex, because I think that you might be reacting very quickly, which is dex, but you also just might see it coming. I think people who are wise or have good insight are probably likely to just feel the tension rising and know that something's about to happen. So I let people roll with wisdom as well.
Yeah, okay. I like that fix. And I also, I think I'd always heard of Popcorn Initiative, but it always just sounded to me like, yeah, why wouldn't the players just nuke whatever they're fighting before that thing even gets a chance to go. I think I had missed the part where the next group, like they can hand it to themselves in the next round to just go again.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
Which obviously is more effective if you have a very big, powerful person who's not going to go down in one round, or if you have enough bad guys that there's still going to be a lot of them at the end of one round. But if you're fighting, like, I don't know, 2 gnolls, it probably won't be quite as efficient.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've tried a couple of alternatives as well that I admittedly haven't super liked, which is remove initiative order. Everybody just kind of declares what they want to do, and then the GM just kind of puzzles it together in terms of like what makes sense, so that, you know, everybody's kind of moving at the same time and moving away from each other at the same time. But I found that really messy. I asked this question because I've been playing with an idea and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, which is what I'm going, and I'm sure this has occurred to other people as well, but I'm going to call it Baldur's Gate Initiative. Because what I've noticed about Baldur's Gate, having played it for probably about 40 hours now, is that, Dael, when you and I were playing it, we didn't have to wait for each other at all. I could just take my whole turn and you were doing your own thing, right? But if I'm playing it on my own, if I have my dudes next to each other in the initiative order, I can swap between them freely, not just deciding who goes first, but actually like making an attack with the fighter, then to use distracting strike or whatever it's called, to give advantage on the next attack, swapping to my rogue, Astarion, to then make a sneak attack, and then swapping back to the fighter to make their second attack against a different enemy if the first one has been slain. So I can break up movement, actions, bonus, I can completely break up their turns between each other. And I kind of wondered how this would work in the ground rules of 5th edition, because I think it would present maybe a couple of problems that maybe we can solve here. But the advantage is that same thing we've been talking about for a little while, which is I take my turn and then 10, 15, 20 minutes go by before I take my turn again, as opposed to the players all talking to each other and figuring out, okay, well, I want to move over there, but I'm stuck next to that dude because he's going to get an attack of opportunity. Why don't you attack him first, and then I'll move and cast a spell at him, and then you can make your second attack to see if we can take him down together. And it becomes a kind of collaborative single-player turn of combat, as opposed to kind of I cast one thing, then it's the next person. I cast one thing, then thoughts?
Well, my first thought is that it seems to happen in Baldur's Gate. I've played a bit on my own now as well. And it seems to happen in Baldur's Gate when you're playing solo, and I guess people have rolled... You have to have rolled initiative next to each other, because if there is a bad guy in between, then you can't do it, which does make some sense. And it makes me think of like those moments when 2 players have rolled the same initiative and they're like, oh, do you want to go first or should I? Wouldn't it be interesting if they did just split up all their actions and stuff with each other? That would feel kind of cool and awesome. But as you were describing it just then, the weird thing is it reminded me a lot of playing 4th edition. It reminded me, and it wasn't like we were splitting up our actions or things like that, but I think it was just kind of the way some of those classes were structured. So we had a warlord in our party who frequently their actions, their turn is going to be giving us another thing to do, is going to be giving our fighter another attack. And so it felt a lot like there was this kind of constant ebb and flow in the battle where someone else is doing something on your turn. But the thing that immediately comes to mind, we had this big sort of dramatic fight that went very badly in a tower full of hobgoblins. And there was a moment when 2 of our party members were separated from us. I was trying to get sort of line of sight so that I could cast a spell to help, but I was surrounded by like 4 bad guys, so I had to duck out of the way of them, and then the fighter kills one of them, and then this is happening, and it all just kind of everyone dogpiled on in the middle of my turn in order to save me so that I could get to where I needed to be in order to save the other 2 party members. It was just one of the coolest turns that I've ever experienced in D&D. It really, that one specific turn has stuck with me. So if there was a way to do that in 5e, I'd be here for it.
Dael, I'm going to ask you a kind of snarky question with the knowledge that turn sounds freaking amazing. How long did that turn take?
Oh, as long as any other turn.
It's still going on, actually.
Yeah. We'll find out how it went.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm actually, in the background, I'm going to look up the exact numbers for you, James.
It was on video. I think you can find out, right? Yeah. Well, this is the trick, is that, as any discussion like this must eventually go, Baldur's Gate is a computer game. D&D is a pen and paper role-playing game. There are things that a computer can keep in its brain that become, prohibitive for players to keep in their brain. Such as, whose turn is it anymore? Such as, did you make 3 attacks or just 2? Things like, did you take your bonus action yet? Who's got a reaction left? And these are great questions that, in a system with a bunch of players who all want to play this way, can be solved by using physical implements. Like maybe at the start of every turn, you bust out a white, blue, and red poker chip to represent action, bonus action, movement. Oh, but because D&D doesn't have a move action anymore, right? Now you have to keep track of your movement granularly. So, right, we still have issues here.
Which, by the way, also, there are things that the computer is tracking in Baldur's Gate that I don't know what it's tracking. It'll just be like, you can't move there. And I'm screaming, why?
So as long as you and your group are all tactics brained enough to keep all of these things in your head using either, manipulable implements or your brains alone or something like that, it's such a cool tactical interface. It makes me think of when I'm playing Lancer, which is very 4E inspired. It's a very tactical game with tactical movement and tactical options, and turns take forever, and you have to be very precise about what you're doing. But it makes it a really fun game. And I think it's a great solution to D&D games where your turns start stretching out longer and longer and longer because you start getting more and more and more options. Because 5e is straddling this line between combat turns taking about 30 seconds at first level and 10 minutes at 10th level. So if you decide you want to go all in on the long turn aspect, I think you should start thinking of ways to make those long turns really fun. And this is a great idea.
Right. And the other aspect to keep in mind is, who are you playing with and whose plan is going to trump the other person's plan? Because I've played with more than enough groups, including people who play together a lot, who decide, well, I want to do my big fireball, so everyone should do X. Where someone else says, well, I'm set up for my big hasted 6 attack round, and by golly, I'm not leaving this square for your fireball, so no. And then it's like, well, who decides which plan is going to take effect? If you're just an initiative, the person whose turn it is gets to make that plan. And that can solve a lot of issues. So I think there could be a game that does that. And D&D 5e might be that game for some people. It's just not that game for all people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to try to solve a couple of these problems as you're talking, James, you already said physical implements. I think that, a lot of war games and miniature tabletop games like Warhammer Underworlds use tokens to say, like, it's part of the rules. When you move an attack, which is a charge action, you put a charge token down next to that miniature, which then dictates what other options it has in subsequent turns until that token is removed. And so you could have, action tokens and bonus action tokens and maybe, a distance token or something that gets put down next to characters as they take their move actions. The other, in terms of whose plan trumps what, with the fighter who's hasted and ready to go and the fireball that's ready to be unleashed, I would hope, and obviously this depends on the group because you do have groups where players feel a bit competitive, but the intention, I suppose, would be that the fighter can move out of the way, and that's just that part of their turn. The fireball drops, and then the fighter can move back in, within the bounds of their movement and do their 6 hasted turn to mop up whoever wasn't slain by the fireball, or vice versa. Maybe you could have like an initiative, like you don't lose initiative entirely. It's just kind of, if 3 people are next to each other, they can interact their turn a little bit, but whoever's highest in initiative in a competing kind of, I want to do this and I want to do that, gets to have the kind of final say on what happens because they've rolled higher in initiative. Just some thoughts on trying to kind of bounce these, solve these problems for this idea. But yeah.
By the way, James, the turn took just shy of 7 minutes.
Pretty good. Much less than my snarky question deserved.
Still not short.
I've seen 7-minute turns in normal 5e
For a
games,
turn that I knew exactly what I wanted to do, still not short.
Yeah.
Somebody said in the comments, you know what else can keep all this stuff in your head? A potential new VTT. I do know. I didn't.
You gave him the segue. Kind soul, you gave him the segue.
I'm not going to quite segue to the news yet, or this is kind of news. I didn't put it on the run sheet. I'm just kind of curious if anybody here has looked at any reviews. There have been some kind of quiet-ish alpha or beta testing of the Wizards of the Coast VTT that have been going on. I've been watching a couple of YouTube channels. I think Nerd Immersion's had access to it and has been doing some loose reviews. I've seen some other videos that I haven't clicked on that have kind of had access to it. From what I haven't watched these videos in detail, so maybe this is a non-topic, because to me, I'm just like, it sounds fine. It sounds like it's very loose, Ted was saying that he wished that the system kind of limited certain things that the players could do so that they can't just, pick up any mini or move things around on their own. But for me personally, I kind of prefer them to be able to do that, because I'd prefer this VTT to be as flexible as possible, because D&D is a game where you might have to be like, you know what, actually this kobold moves over here or whatever. I'd rather that the limitations of the software doesn't limit what the DM or the players can do at the table, because you're not limited when you have physical minis in front of you, Has anybody else seen any of this? Has any thoughts on it, or just let this one float by?
Ben, I think this topic you've brought up about the flexibility versus rules adherence of the system is probably going to be the great debate of this entire VTT, ignoring any sort of cultural trappings surrounding it. Because I think I agree with your opinion. I can think of a lot of people who probably won't agree with your opinion. And I think these developers are in for a hell of a storm when they try and figure out whose opinion they should hard code into their computer program. I think they might be able to, play both sides by having some back-end DM tools, turn certain functionalities off and on. But ultimately, I think it's way better to just have a virtual tabletop that the DM can arbitrate, rather than having, the back end of a video game that the DM must abide by.
I have not seen it, but I totally agree with James there. It's going to be interesting. People have opinions about what the game should be, much less what the tools to make the games will be.
Yeah, I can see it going both ways. I will admit, I thought, there's nothing stopping players from picking up the kobolds on a physical tabletop and moving the miniatures around if they want, aside from don't be assholes. But at the same time, playing Twilight Imperium on Tabletop Simulator, I was the dude who would just pick up random elements of the game that weren't being used and drop them in someone's play space secretly and wait until somebody noticed. So, chaos rules. Anyway.
Wait, here's a bit of news. Speaking of ETTs, Roll20. Has anyone seen Roll20 buying Dungeon Scrawl? Yeah. Dungeon Scrawl is a map-making bit of software that's actually very, very handy, very intuitive, very strong. And it was purchased by Roll20, and everyone got excited because you could make a map in Dungeon Scrawl in 30 seconds. But it doesn't look like it's going to be integrated soon or easily. So that became out, yay! Oh, moment. But if Roll20 can integrate Dungeon Scrawl into it, so a DM can build a 6-room dungeon in Roll20 in 30 seconds, that's amazing.
Definitely. One of my big limitations of avoiding VTTs is the time that it takes to create a VTT map, and I know that even Roll20 can kind of be used like a virtual whiteboard where you can just draw on it and like you would on a literal grid battle map. But if I'm going to have digital, it's got to look cool, otherwise I may as well just use physical, in my opinion. unless you're playing online.
Here's my only real complaint about this. It's a complaint more about Dungeon Scrawl than about the acquisition. I just remember back in 2021, Dyson Logos, the guy who makes those very popular Hatchwork style maps, he tweeted this, among other sort of ornery things. Congrats to Dungeon Scrawl. It emulates my work so well that I now get weekly complaints from Scrawl fans that I'm ripping off your free tools to make money. When in fact,
I just assumed that he was involved in some aspect. Wow.
Yeah, I was on a podcast with Devin Rue, the Critical Role map maker, last week where we talked about this a little bit, but it's, this is kind of a part of my fear about generative AI. Not to say, for example, that Dungeon Scrawl necessarily uses what we describe as generative AI right now, but it does use something not unlike it. It's that, when you've got a distinctive style, and regrettably for Dyson, his distinctive style is kind of easily lifted. Its strength is often found in its simplicity rather than its, extremely detailed rendering. Is that, anyone with a program and a dream can now make a pretty good Dyson Logos map, sans any of the artisanry that goes into it.
It's also it's a tricky one in terms of because I know that he's done lots of tutorials showing people how to do it, how to draw maps like that themselves. And I know that in my experience, I release a lot of content for free attached to my YouTube channel. I do videos explaining all of it. And I, for many years, the only reason that I had a Dungeon Masters Guild account was so that I could leave comments on people's products saying, hey, if you're going to use my design work, don't charge for it. I don't mind if you are, using my stuff. If you just leave a credit somewhere and don't charge people for it, because I'm releasing it for free. So it's weird when you come along and are getting paid for a thing that I designed, right? And so then you're in this weird gray area though, because it's like, but I did release it for free. And at least legally speaking, I think morally it's a bit like, oh, come on. But at least legally speaking, I wouldn't have a particularly strong case. You know what I mean?
I mean, there's from the creative side of things, and this is a kind of an interesting rabbit hole we've tumbled down, but there is an anxiety and from a creator perspective of like inspired by versus plagiarized, because there's definitely, the way that creativity works is that you see something, creativity in many ways is a mirror to society. That's right. We've gone there. We've gone full college student. Sorry, let me translate. And so often it's like, oh, that thing's cool. I want to, I've described things in my game via pure description of an artwork that I've seen online, right? But if I was to describe that without using the artwork in a book, and it's just, using words and maybe I add a few things to it, is that plagiarism of that artwork if that artwork is never seen in the final product? I've definitely copied or tried to emulate Dyson's map style before, definitely not to their proficiency, but just in the basic kind of hatcheting the borders style to make it clear where the dungeon is and where the walls of the dungeon sort of are. And AI and generative art is kind of a different discussion in ways, because that's not a person that's emulating. That's literal emulation. That's that's not inspiration. That's literally drawing numbers into a thing. But it's an interesting topic, and it's why, copyright law is so weird, is because the law and creativity almost don't work together, right? Like it's hard to make laws around creativity and the way the creative space necessarily works. And not to mention that two people can have the same idea in vacuums that look very similar, when they come together.
Oh, we've just, brushed up against an enormous cultural issue. I'm sure we can resolve this in the next 5 minutes, don't you think, lads?
Perfect. Let's do it.
We've got other topics to get onto, so James, you're on the clock. Go.
Yeah, pass.
All right, let us jump to the other virtual news that we're a little bit late getting to be honest. This happened a couple of weeks ago, but I'm extremely excited, especially because I finally got to jump in and have a play. Nexus 5e from Demiplane have dropped a whole bunch of third-party supplements onto Nexus 5e, which is kind of their competitor to D&D Beyond, if you will. They have dropped Tal'Dorei Reborn, appeared there only, I think, a week or two after it appeared on D&D Beyond. They also have Tome of Beasts 1 and 2 from Kobold Press, which are two excellent monster manuals. And the number one monster manual in all the realms, you might say, the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire, at least for Dark Fantasy, the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire is also available on Nexus 5e or 5e Nexus, whichever way around it is. And I could not be more excited because I love me a monster search database.
End of sentence. I love me.
Look, truths aside, I used Kobold Fight Club back in the day when I was trying to come up, this dungeon needs some sort of fire-themed monster, or I want a dragon, but I'm not sure what dragon I want, which one, kind of fits the CR. And D&D Beyond has been great for that as well, but seeing all my Kobold Press monsters, all the Monster Grimoire monsters, and the SRD monsters kind of together in a searchable database has been absolutely fantastic.
Well, I want to know how many of those books James Hake wrote for, because I have a feeling it was more than one.
Well, Shawn, you're the one who led the Monster Grimoire. Let's not false modesty your way out of this one. No,
but I mean, you've worked for Kobold Press. You've obviously worked on the Tal'Dorei campaign book. You've worked for Grim Hollow.
I'll bet they have Creature Codex on there. I wasn't involved in any of the Tome of Beasts, if I'm remembering right, but I was definitely on Creature Codex. I can't believe how late my turn-in for that one was. That's probably my most embarrassing publisher moment.
Don't advertise that. This is public. This is public.
That's not why it's in the Nexus now. We're still waiting on James' monsters.
I'm really excited to have all of those monsters searchable. There's this sort of pessimist in my brain that has all of these little quibbles that I want to, spew out there into the world. But honestly, it's just really cool to have a huge monster database. People go through the monster manual all the time and are like, where are all the mid-CR plants and stuff like that? And books like Tome of Beasts 1, 2, 3, Creature Codex literally had those goals in mind. Right? They were like, let's fill in the gaps of the monster manual. MCDM's Flea Mortals, which I'm sure will be up on that site in due time, had those things in mind, though kind of the opposite way around. It's like, let's do the stuff that was in the monster manual in a cooler way. I think that if you took Flea Mortals, the Tome of Beasts, you could basically replace the monster manual and have some rad stuff that does 5e in a way that no player would expect. And then when you start going into genre, right, you can look at the monsters from the Monster Grimoire for your dark fantasy game. You can look at the creatures in the Ethereal Expanse campaign guide that's going to come out in the next year or so. And I'm sure if our Monster Grimoire is there on 5e Nexus, we'll have the Ethereal Expanse monsters on there too. And then you've got your swashbuckling high magic game. It's just awesome. It makes me happy to be an RPG player in a game when it's so easy to use all of this stuff at once.
Mm-hmm. I've already been using it because I own every single one of those books, and I am constantly going, I need a new monster for my players. They know everything from the monster manual. So I pull out the Tome of Beasts and I flip, pull out, flip. And now I'm like, I could just search all these. And I did.
Yeah.
And it was great. Yep.
Searchability for me, it's like the way that I use D&D Beyond. I don't tend to use D&D Beyond to play. And I also don't tend to drag and drop monsters into my game. But I'm always looking stuff up beforehand as a starting point. Like Ben, when you mentioned looking for a dragon, what kind of dragon do I want? could never be me. I would just be like, I want a dragon, so I will write one right now. But it is always nice when I'm sort of conceptualizing a session or a campaign or what have you, to be able to look for a close starting point. And the more sort of collections I can look through, the better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just that thing of dragons might be a weird example because they're so different and specific between each other. But like James said, like a mid-tier CR5 plant monster, I can just put that in and refine the results down. Previously, I had to flip through a book like a Neanderthal, and now I can just really easily search plant and CR whatever, set the parameters. I want it to be resistant to fire. I put that, like whatever it is. I love me a search engine for monsters. So yeah, go get the Monster Grimoire on 5e Nexus among a luminary, I'm going to use that word, of other third-party supplements as well. Speaking of absolutely fantastic things, I love this listener email. I'm going to ask you this question first, Dael Kingsmill. What is the email address that you email to contact the Eldritch Lorecast?
Why, I believe it's podcast@ghostfiregaming.com.
Okay, all right, interesting. Shawn Merwin, what would you say to
What's
that?
happening? I don't like this.
I'm afraid to answer differently than Dael, so what she said.
Agreeance among the cast is good. James Hake.
Ghostpod@castfiregaming.org, something like that.
James. Always the problem student. Apologize to this emailer. I just remembered this, but they genuinely did send in an email asking what the email was to email the podcast.
That's a good email. That's a good email. Who said that? Who said that?
I will find out. And I will make it public. I should have saved that for next week. Lex has also emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. I love this question, asking about implicit storytelling in an RPG. How do you communicate lore/flavor that isn't just presented in block text or, I suppose, a GM's, 5-minute long explanation of a thing? How much can a random table, a spell, a subclass, a class, a species tell about the game world? And is this a better way to communicate lore, particularly to players that might be resistant to expositious monologues, but enjoy discovering things through exploration?
Well, there's a lot we can learn from video games on this. There are many games out there that are prided on their environmental storytelling. Sometimes facetiously, like in Dead Space, where, there's a bunch of aliens that have had their limbs chopped off, and then, 3 feet down the corridor, there's a huge graffiti scroll saying, "Cut off the limbs," to tell you to cut off the aliens' limbs to kill them. Which, I don't know, so sometimes is the average puzzle difficulty of a D&D puzzle, because I think most D&D people get a little bit distracted at the corners. But you look at all the great games that are praised for their environmental storytelling of games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. FromSoft games get this treatment a lot. Trying to figure out how to translate that into a tabletop game can be quite challenging, because these games do a lot of heavy lifting with their atmosphere, which is all visual. To which I say, what you need to do to get people to think that you are telling a very environmental, compelling, implicit story is just to set up a really good atmosphere and tone. And the trick with that is your players have to buy in, right? You can't tell a horror game if your players are not interested in being scared. You can't do the Lord of the Rings if your players are eye-rolling at your extremely loquacious verbiage about nature and, the size of the armies and stuff like that. So because of the raw nature of tabletop games, you can get as much good advice as you want, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the social agreement between the GM and the players.
And like you can learn a lot from role-playing games, you can also learn a lot from education. Because in education, what are you trying to do? You are trying to impart knowledge onto the people listening to you in a way that will go into their brain and hopefully remain there. And so what's the worst way that most people learn is if someone is standing there droning on and on monotonously and you're never getting to the point and you're not even really sure what you're supposed to be learning. So if you follow or know any education tropes, that's not the word I'm looking for. There's a way to let the listener anticipate what you're about to say. You want them actively learning as opposed to passively learning. All of those things can translate well. Ben knows what I'm talking about. All of those can translate
we've passed
well
into pedagogy now.
Oh, yes. Translate well into role-playing games. So you don't want to drone on and on for more than, say, a minute about something. Why do, sometimes to a fault, DMs like players to roll dice? Sometimes even when it doesn't make any sense to roll dice because there's no consequences to a success or failure, because people like to roll dice and they begin to pay attention again when you roll dice. So that's why sometimes DMs will call for checks when they're not necessary and hope to re-engage someone. But you can do it when you're trying to tell them something, because no matter what they roll, you can then deliver the knowledge that you were about to deliver. But now their brain has changed from, oh boy, I'm being lectured at, to I've just made a roll. Now there is going to be a consequence and I am ready to accept that consequence, when it could be the bit of knowledge, the bit of lore, the bit of exposition that you were going to be boring with previously.
Yes. All of this feels like it feeds what I'm going to say. It makes me very happy. I was going to use the example of video games as well, but what you shouldn't do, perhaps. So Ben and I playing Baldur's Gate the other day, we had a conversation about picking up the books and the fact that there's all this writing in the books that you can pick up. And you asked whether I read the books in Skyrim. No, I did not. No one did. I can't tell you actually much of the lore of the Elder Scrolls because so much of it is delivered in these long passages of the books that you can pick up. And there are lots of people who are going to sit and read those. No judgment against those people at all. I'm pretty sure the reason I'm a mythology nerd is because my brother read every entry that came up in Age of Mythology, and I just absorbed it because I was the little sister hanging around bored. So sometimes it does sink in, but you're really relying on a lot of heavy lifting from the listener or the reader. And it's the same with, Baldur's Gate, like I mentioned, it's the same with Dragon Age, which is wild because Dragon Age has such good implicit lore, like, delivery, that it's so bizarre that they will also, particularly in Inquisition, be like, here's a long passage of information about Theatre Brightaxe. I don't care.
Oh.
I don't care and I don't want to read it. Meanwhile, you look at like Dragon Age 2, the architecture in that game, the murals in that game deliver so much world building information about, this is Kirkwall. It was a slave city. That's like the main thing about it. And you learn that in like the first loading screen because of the mural they've got in the background. You know what I mean? So much of it is imparted by sort of just tone, vibe, art. Art is a huge part of that. The other thing that I was going to say is Mary Stewart. So this is, speaking of loquacious verbiage about plants, the first time my mother handed me a Mary Stewart book, she skipped the first 10 pages of the book before handing it to me, and she said, nothing much has happened. She's just talked about flowers. But Mary Stewart is really good at the sort of descriptive language that talks about the journey. So this is less exploration and more travel, which I think are different things. It should be treated as different things in D&D. But Mary Stewart is really good at giving you sort of lore dumps in the context of travel that I think are more easily kind of digestible. So there's a passage in, I think, My Brother Michael, where she's talking about like real world places. She's talking about traveling through Greece. And she talks about this three-way crossroads where in ancient times a king was murdered by his son, right? And for me, that's a delectable morsel that's a reference to Oedipus. But as she's talking about, this crossroads and this mountain and Parnassus, home of the gods, right? She just drops in these descriptions of the things that you're seeing as you're traveling but throws you little morsels of the sort of history of the world and the religion and things like that I think sit in a really fun way that make people curious. You know, if you have a mountain range and you say, yes, this is called Heaven's Council or something like that, that's the name of the mountain range, and there are 7 mountain peaks that represent the thrones of each of the gods, that gives just a little bit, you know, it's just that little taste that makes them go, ooh, who are the 7 gods? Without having to like force feed, you know, here comes the aeroplane, here comes the lore.
I want to speak to this question moving a little bit into the next one, which was from Nick. I think these questions dovetail pretty well together, asking about how GMs can tend, it's kind of a given that they can have the fiat to be able to restrict particularly species options or ancestry options within a role-playing game if that ancestry doesn't fit within the world that they're running, but also class and subclass options possibly. And do GMs restrict monster options based on that world as well? And I think that for me, the way to create implicit storytelling is through intention. And really, I take forever to prep my games. You know, I virtually write an adventure module every time I prep a game because I don't want to roll randomly on a random chart. Or if I do create a random chart, which was referenced in Lex's question, I have crafted that chart myself to be like, these are the things that are going to show up here. As a, like, I don't want them wandering around Fallowheart, this city of night in Astoria, and in the middle of it, you know, I don't even know what, a coatl just like is flying around, you know, through the middle of the streets. And so what would people find there? And I think that intention is important in your monster selection, not just for like regional locations, but also specific locations. You know, what monsters is this mage in their tower likely to have in their employ? And why are those monsters there? The species or the ancestries that the players choose from, but also those that they run across within game. I think class and subclass is actually a really great way, and we've been talking about this in videos on our YouTube channel. If you have a planeswalker, I can't think of what they're actually called, but that ranger that can teleport between dimensions.
The Horizon Walker.
The Horizon Walker. Instantly, your game probably has portals floating around the place to teleport to different planes, because if it doesn't, why does that subclass exist? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so being intentional about what you kind of put into the ingredients, the melting pot of your game, and when you bring those ingredients in and have those things show up, I think can do a lot of that implicit storytelling for setting the tone and atmosphere and story of your game. This doesn't always go well because of 5e. 5e can interfere with this, and I have a quick example is when I have people in urban or villages, you know, safe areas, the types of encounters that I choose to use are meant to be fairly mundane. You know, people, animals, beasts, maybe a monstrosity, but like people know about that monstrosity that lives down in the cave, you know, but don't go near that cave. And then as my players moved out of a village and started going into the dreaded Valley of Mists, there was a rock which spoke to them with a face. And the whole intention was to be like, yeah, you're not in civilization anymore. You have at some point stepped beyond the veil into into the dreaded Valley of Mists. And here are these fantastical monsters of rocks that will talk to you and ghosts in this valley and, you know, whatever it happens to be. And one of my players asked, they were like, is this normal? Like, do rocks always talk in this place, or like, what's going on here? I was like, okay, and tried to explain the effect I'm going for here is you have traveled beyond the veil. So sometimes a bit of explicit explanation might be needed.
Last week we talked about magic. Everything is magic, and it's the same conversation, right? It's what does your world, and it's funny because on the 0.75 best podcast in all the lands, Mastering Dungeons, on our Discord, we were having this very conversation moments after we had been talking about it here, which was, I don't like the direction of this game or that game because it does make everything magical. I want my fighters to be fighters, not wizards with swords. I want my rogues to be tricky, not tricky because of magic. And all of this comes together here when we talk about lore and how it's presented and all of these things. You need that flexibility as a storyteller. You need that flexibility, but then when you have that flexibility, you also take on the onus of delivering it to your players in a way that is pleasing to them and makes them understand why I don't want any divine casters in this world. I don't want any clerics or paladins. And this is why. And I'm not going to sit down at our session 0 and say, this treatise I'm about to present you is why my world is that way. Let me explain it to you in the game. Let me make you receptive to these things, and you will learn why this is the case, and you will be amazed and delighted by it.
We've got random Dael fan in chat says, I tried to solve that in my own game and wrote up a 10-page document of common knowledge about the world. No one read it. Mm-hmm. Oh, a relatable dilemma. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's that thing of trying to force feed your players the information that you want them to have. And it's just so difficult. I have been there. I've also gone through the process of taking that information, boiling it down. I'm like, how can I condense this into just one page for this person? Okay, how can I condense this down into half a page for this person? How can I condense this down into just some dot points? What are the key pieces of information that I really want them to know about this? And even then, sometimes they do not read it. And it can be really sort of disheartening in a lot of ways. But players gotta be like that. I think sometimes if you are gonna be that cruel DM like I am, who really limits the kind of subclasses and classes that your players are playing with, you can kind of sneak it in through the names of features. You can sneak in little bits and pieces just in the stuff that they do have to read in order to play their character. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Horrible Cabbage mentions in the comments something that I really agree with, and it's got something to do with the way you describe things, and it involves a balance between the implicit and the explicit. Right, I can imagine a scene. The first session of a new campaign, everyone is gathered in a tavern. And I say, as you gather around this table, the bartender approaches you, a server approaches you, and this server looms above you, 7 feet tall, with 4 arms covered in insectoid chitin. It looks at you through compound eyes and speaks to you in a cocktail of pheromones that enter through your nervous system rather than through your ears. And you get exactly the sense of what it's trying to say to you. What are you drinking? And then I would immediately append to that, oh, and this is an insect folk. You know exactly who these are. This is normal to you. And while it may be completely abnormal to the characters or to the players, this is just a little hump for them to get over mentally, where it's like, oh, okay, but so we can just talk with this person like they're a normal person. Yeah, okay, cool, got it.
Yeah. And, history checks, religion checks, those sort of things exist within the game for a reason, right? Players that are really interested or want their character to feel like they are knowledgeable, you can give them the lore as they need it. That's the point of having those checks there. And so implicit storytelling, can be semi-explicit in terms of, you walk into a temple and there's a great statue in front of you that's trimmed with gold, clearly of an important figure. If someone is interested to know, they can roll a history or a religion check or whatever relevant check, right? If the players are not interested to know, you can end the description there so that you're not dragging it out for them, which is something I need to get better at, honestly.
A statue or a mural for giving information, right? Here's what you see, and then they can roll to find out what it is referencing, right?
Yeah.
Which is great. It does also, it's that thing that I was talking about, right? With the three-way crossroads where a king was murdered by his son, right? For me, I know what that means. Someone else might just be like, all right, cool. And you get that sort of level of difference if you're rolling history or religion or whatever. And I think that's great. my only thing is that I wish that I could just give them the picture in my brain when I'm talking about a mural or a statue. Oh, how I wish.
Yeah.
I think a good little shortcut to that is to take, just like in the Fellowship of the Ring, they're in Moria, all the dwarves are dead. Clearly something terrible has happened. Gandalf finds a chronicle written by the dwarf Ori in Balin's tomb, and he rattles off a bit. Clearly, Gandalf is reading pages upon pages of dwarvish script, and he just kind of says, "They have taken the South Hall. Drums in the deep. They are coming." And, that's all the players need to know. Is that, oh, crap. The drums are the sound you must beware. And then, of course, when they start coming, bum, 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 the drum beat comes up. If you don't have a Gandalfish NPC with which to communicate only the vital information, following Dead Space's example and just scrawling the relevant information on the wall instead of having to communicate your ideas in a quite detailed mural. Actually, we make fun of Dead Space for saying that after all of their lovely implicit environmental storytelling, but you know what? The playtesters got the point. They figured it out.
Yeah.
What's the most common writing advice that you hear? 3 words.
Show don't tell. Show don't tell.
Which is great advice unless you need to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes you just need to tell. Sometimes the showing will kill you. As if you have players who don't want to be shown, they just want to be told. As James just showed us in his example, where Gandalf just said, "They've taken the South. Okay, we know where we need to go. We don't need to see everything. We're told the important plot point. We can move on. We don't need to be shown."
You know what actually immediately came to mind as an example of great implicit lore delivery that is tell, don't show is Star Wars. Frequently, Star Wars will just be like, completed the Kessel Run in under 12 parsecs. And you're like, I don't know what that is or what that means, but you get the point. The point is the Millennium Falcon is fast. It just tells you a thing, but doesn't explain it. It's like, there you go, there's some lore. There's a Kessel Run. Just go with it. But it does it all the time. And you know what? Famous for its lore and its world building. And
it starts with a whole page of lore dump.
Right.
It does.
The whole scrolling. Right.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is, forget everything we said at first. This is the important. No, I'm just kidding. I want to add to that and mildly disagree with something that Dael said earlier. This is a mild disagreement about picking up
unnecessarily
books.
Called out.
No, very necessarily. About picking up books, right? Because I am an absolute sucker for a dead body with a journal in my D&D games. So much so, it's kind of become an unintentional trope.
I love a letter.
Yeah, or a letter works just as well.
It's shorter and I can leave out more details.
Well, often what I'll say is like, you much like a video game RPG will do, it'll have like some block text that says like much of the pages of this journal are water damaged or burned, so you can't make out. But fortunately, you can make out the one important bit, which is, a couple lines long. And the reason I like that is because within your implicit storytelling, you want to make sure that the important things are still communicated and that it's not too obscure. I think Colville calls it like signal versus noise or something like that.
The signal to noise ratio, yeah.
Yeah. And NPCs that they can have a discussion with is also a great example of this, where the NPC brings flavor and personality and opinion. I've got an NPC that's currently traveling with my party, and he's great because he knows everything about Astoya from his very specific perspective. And the players don't know much at all because they're foreigners to that land. And so they can ask him if they're ever not sure about something, A, getting a bit of NPC interaction, but B, also, realizing that they're getting the information from his point of view, And so they have to take that information and marry it with their own thoughts. This particular character is loyal to the Crimson Court of Astoya. And so when the players are like, they're all vampires, this is bad. Like, this is a bad situation. They're taking blood for tax. He can be like, yeah, don't your guys take blood for tax? Like, isn't that normal? Like, isn't that not done everywhere? And it's it's clear lore delivery, but it's still engaging because it's not just, rattling off information. It has to be drawn out of the NPC in some capacity.
And Ben, I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, which is, so ignore everything we've just said. And it's that, you can have NPCs that present highly opinionated views. And that's really, really useful for communicating information.
Oh, that's a classic Dragon Age technique.
Right? Yeah. I mean, just like you were saying there
yeah.
with your Crimson Court supporter. But sometimes it's really good to just tell your players exactly what's happening, because otherwise they will tie themselves in knots over misunderstanding what information you've just communicated to them. And sometimes it's a misunderstanding. It's a really dumb misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding that no one who actually lives in that world would ever make, because, they have a fundamental bedrock of context that the players don't have. And whenever that happens, rather than, it becomes a gotcha if you try and nail them on that kind of misunderstanding. You should just tell them. Like, they're trying to figure it out. They will be happy if you just tell them. They won't get bored. They'll be like, oh, we've been missing that the whole time? Okay, all right, never mind.
There's a couple times where, I've said to players, I don't want you to mistake this for a red herring, Sometimes you want a red herring. Yeah, go talk to this NPC. He might be able to help you out. NPC is already dead, or, it's another story thread. But sometimes you're like, my brother died and his body was left at the top of the mountain. And the players go, oh, well, we have to go get the body. And I'll be like, no. I don't want you to mistake that for a red. That's just a bit of background information. The thing that sticks out as important to your character is this other thing instead, And, I was watching it was probably on Facebook, a short that I was flipping through, and it was a guy giving a lecture about how to deliver information in a TED Talk or something. And it's about cadence and breaking things up and being slow sometimes, but then also swapping to really quick pace of speaking, and getting low, but then going high, and
the dynamics that I was missing so much when my voice was gone.
yeah, sure. And, that doesn't just pertain to the pace of speaking and the pitch of a voice, but also, having a variety of different implicit techniques in there with NPCs, with short bits of text that give plain information, with a description of something that can be investigated more, with, that may or may not be picked up on, with the monsters that you choose in a specific, all these things create a tapestry of implicit detail that help communicate the story to the players, and vice versa, back the other way.
J Pizza Beats in chat says, my players will ask me lore questions mid-session, not because they want to know the lore, but rather because they want to make sure they know the consequences of a course of action.
Sure.
Which is fair and good, in my opinion. And I agree. And I also think that it ties in a little bit with one of Shawn's tricks from earlier, which is tie the lore to succeeding on a roll, because then it becomes a little treat, right? It becomes a thing that they're like, yes, my reward. I think, yes, absolutely. It is the best place to probably deliver lore is when it's tied to consequences and rewards.
And
I think just lands.
Sometimes people will then call for that history roll. I rolled a 5. Okay, well, I'm not going to tell you the lore. The trick to that is to tell them the complete opposite of the truth, but deliver it so that they know that it is. You heard a rumor that said that the queen is kind and benevolent, and all the dead bodies you see on spikes on the side of the road, that's just a misunderstanding. The queen is really, really very benevolent. It's so you've heard.
Sure.
Having rolled the 5, they know that is completely wrong, and you're delivering the information that they need to know in a humorous and engaging way.
Yes. Also, turn that statue that Ben was talking about into a statue that breathes fire. Now it's a trap, and now it matters if they succeed on that history check.
That's going to be the player's motivation for wanting to learn the lore, right? Yeah, I had a player at one of my tables when I was pro GMing who I loved to bits because he loved the lore. He wanted that 10-page, breakdown. He wanted to history check everything and learn, and that was his jive, right? And that's great. But that the sort of player who's that into it, in my experience, is a little bit of a rarity. And the reason the players want to learn the lore is to progress the story of their character, is to, you know, achieve something or not achieve something, is to, because I don't want to tie it to, I don't want to say all players are gamey and they all want it to be a success or fail mechanic, and that's what the lore hinges on, because there are players, even if they prefer that success or fail kind of thing, they're interested in the storytelling more than the pure mechanics. I'm not trying to paint an overly broad brush. What I'm trying to say is, that's why players will want to know the lore, is to interact with the game, not just for the sake of knowing the lore, you know, otherwise I'd go read a book.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Also, Turbo KKV in chat says, lore through ominous dream. Yeah, I mean, particularly if you've got like a warlock or a cleric or a paladin.
Actually a good idea, yeah. One last email that came in from Andy Demps, emailing in a correction from Elderwood Academy fame. Minor correction. This is from a couple episodes back. Thieves Guild, I can't actually remember what we said, so take this with a grain of salt. Thieves Guilds did not originate in D&D. They were first mentioned in the short story Thieves' House, 1943, by Fritz Lieber, who I believe may have been basing it on earlier, you know, tidbits of history as well, if not a formal guild.
I usually assume that if someone says it was first recorded to have been written here, that it means that it was based. You know, it's like people say Shakespeare invented the word elbow, but the scene where he says elbow wouldn't make sense if the people in the audience didn't know what an elbow was. So it's like, I think the word elbow existed. But yeah, no, good correction. Take back everything I said.
Well, if you want to write in a correction, please don't make that a thing, unless you really feel fiery about it. Actually, you know what? Blanket statement, please don't. Leave a YouTube comment. You can leave a YouTube comment.
If
we're wrong, feel free to tell us, but comments is probably...
If I'm wrong, please don't tell me.
I want to live in my ignorance.
Leave it in the comments, because then other people can argue with you as well. I mean, have conversation. Get the conversation going. If you want to keep this conversation going, get down in the comments of this video. You can leave a comment. I read them all. Sadly, that's true. Or you can leave us a thumbs up or a star review if you're listening to this on Spotify or wherever. Yeah, I know, but do you read all the comments on your videos?
Probably after a couple weeks I stopped checking on them, but I do read most of them.
Yeah, okay. No, I read all of them. All of them. Every single one.
Friends,
that's right.
We're trying to get you to make the Lorecast so popular that Ben loses his mind trying to read all the comments. We want to drive him into a sort of Lovecraftian haze from how many comments he's reading.
Yes.
That or loses the capacity to read all the comments. That would also be equally, maybe preferred even, James. Otherwise, next week we'll be like, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch. They're all around me. Anyway, that's what I'd be like if I lost my mind. My name's been Ben Byrne, here with James Hake, Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill. We will be back next week in all the places. You can join us on Twitch, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific on a Monday, 9 a.m. Tuesday, Australian Standard Time, and we will catch you there. Okay, goodbye. Nobody do it. He has to learn. He has to take us off eventually. He has to take us offline eventually. All right, we'll see who breaks first then.
We're just going to sit here in silence. That's the plan.
I mean, it doesn't have to be silence.
It's a stare down.
Sitting.
This is going to be a great
is the
gag.
opposite of standing.
A great gag for the Twitch only.
Sitting is the
Joey's
opposite
close.
of running around.
All right. But we will break you one week, Dante.
I can't believe it was Ben.